Hello, and welcome to the next video in our series of Intro to Creative Web Dev video series that we've been doing. In the last video, you learned about HTML and HTML tags, so you know how to write HTML, which is markup that lets you specify different kinds of content. So, for example, an H1 tag tells your browser that a piece of content is a heading, or a P tag says that a piece of content is a paragraph. An image tag says that something's an image, and so on. So by now, you should know how to use an editor to write HTML. I used Replit in the last video, so I'm just going to maybe create a new project from scratch, and I'll name it. So I'm going to pick an HTML, CSS, JavaScript project first, and I'm going to name it something like CSS project. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. And I'm going to click create, and this will open up an editor to an HTML file. And I've been recommending that you don't start with the content that's in here by default, just because it's a little complicated. So let me maybe steal some HTML from myself here and start with something a little simpler. And okay, now I can run this, and just to sort of review, this is HTML that specifies the different kinds of content. So this H1 tag says that this is a heading, this P tag says that this is a paragraph, and so on. So that's all good, and that is like the most fundamental piece of web development is HTML and HTML tags. But by now you've probably noticed that the way that it is styled, or it's the way it looks, is not super beautiful. It's not super interesting. It's kind of just the boring defaults. It's like a white background with black text, and it's like whatever the default font is. And that's because we haven't added any styles to our code yet. And all of this was meant to introduce the fact that this week we are learning about CSS, which lets you style your content. So you can think of HTML as telling the browser what kinds of content to display, and CSS tells your browser how to display that content. So for example, I have this H1 tag, and that's a heading, and the browser is displaying it in some default styles, which give it this kind of like bigger and bolder font size. But what if I wanted to change that? And that's where CSS comes into play. So maybe just to get started, I'll talk about some of the syntax that's involved. So for starters, one thing you could do if you wanted to add CSS to your HTML is you can use it's called a style attribute. And so I can use an attribute by, say, maybe I'll change the color of my P tag. Actually, I'll use my H1 tag since it's a little easier to see. So I'll add a space kind of like inside of my HTML tag, like after the name of it and before the like closing caret symbol. So I'm going to have a space, and then I'll use the keyword style. So I'll say style equals, and then I want 2 quotation marks, and then inside of those quotation marks, I can give it a set of properties. So property name and value, which specify the styling of the content, in this case of the H1 tag. So just to get something working, maybe I'll specify that the color should be, let's say, red. And I'll run this and see what happens. And there you go. You now have an H1 tag which has a color of red. Maybe I'll add some white space just to format it a little bit better. And this is the fundamental process for CSS. I've added a style tag, and I've set that style tag equal to some stuff in quotation marks, and that stuff is properties and values. Now, similar to what you would have learned about before with P5, now your question might be, well, how do I know what the possibilities are for these properties and values? And the answer is you can go to your favorite search engine and type in like CSS Properties, maybe Properties, and there's probably something that has a whole bunch of options for you. So CSS Reference, this looks pretty promising. Here's a big old list of all of the different things that you can specify about an HTML element. So maybe I'll pick on, I don't know, maybe the border property, which, where is it? Border, here. So I can specify, don't pay too close attention to the syntax here because I'm going to get to it eventually, but I just want to talk about the fact that there are properties and values. So I have this kind of border, which is, looks like the value is actually three words. And so I'm going to copy this back into my code. And oh my goodness, my computer's running really slow. We're going to see what happens. Here it is. And so to talk about like multiple CSS properties, or to use multiple CSS properties, I'm going to have a semicolon in there, our good friend the semicolon, and I'm going to paste the border property in there as well. So I'm going to run this and see what happens. And now my h1 tag has a big solid red border, and maybe I can change this a little bit just to kind of get something working. And now I have my h1 tag, my h1 element has a style which is set to the list of properties. And in this case there are two properties. One is the color property set to red, so my text is red, and the other one is this border property which is set to 5 pixels solid green. And that tells the browser to style my h1 element using those rules. Okay, so that's the fundamentals of like CSS properties, and you can look up a bunch more and you can style your tags kind of one at a time this way, but that's going to be kind of annoying, especially if you get into a case where you have something like this where you say like maybe like my name is Kevin and maybe another one, I don't know, my favorite food is ice cream. So you have these multiple p tags now, and now what if I wanted to change all of them to blue? And I could do that. I could do that by saying p style equals color blue, and I could run that and double check that it worked, and okay, that one is blue, and I could add that to the next p tag and the next p tag. But you know, when you get into a project where you have a bunch of different HTML elements and you all want them to have styles, it can be really annoying to have to do it in a bunch of different places. So generally you actually won't use the style attribute. I wanted to introduce it first just because it's kind of the most direct way to get to styling stuff, but usually you won't do it that way. Instead, what I'm going to do is add a style tag. And so its style is another HTML tag, just like all of the other ones. You usually put it in the head section. So I'm going to put a style tag in my head section, and Replit is kind enough to automatically close it, and I'll give myself some white space. And I'm going to maybe delete some of this stuff that I added before. So now I'm back to just normal, boring defaults. Okay. So now I have this style tag, and right now it doesn't contain anything. So if I run this, you'll just see that it has the defaults. But inside of this style tag, you can now write CSS syntax. And remember from last week and from previous weeks that different languages have different syntaxes, which are the different like symbols and letters and words that you can use in that language. So P5, for example, had things like the circle function, and you had to type the word circle and then a parenthesis and then some numbers, and that was P5's syntax. HTML has these tags where you have like a curly or an angle bracket and then a name of a tag and then a closing HTML tag. That's HTML's syntax. And now CSS's syntax is a new kind of syntax. where what you want to do is you want to give it a few things. So I'm going to be inside of my style tag here, typing CSS Syntax. So the first thing you need is a selector. And just to get something working, I'm going to start with an element selector. So the selector tells CSS what you want to style. So in this case, maybe I want to style all of my p tags. So I'm going to type the p here, and then you want an open curly brace and then a closing curly brace, and I'll add some white space as well. And then inside of those curly braces, this is where you put your property names and values. So for example, I can say color blue maybe, and let me just start with that. Let me run that and just see if that's working. And indeed, now my p tags are indeed blue. And you end it in semicolon so that now if I want another one, let's say, actually let me just say, like, your question is likely going to be pretty often like, what are the properties out there? So I'll go back to that page that I was just on. So in case I didn't know some of this ahead of time, I could add a border. If you're new to CSS, I kind of recommend just kind of skimming through just to understand the kinds of things you can do. I don't read every single thing, don't feel like you need to click into every single one, but just to get an idea of the kinds of things you can do. So I don't know, I haven't really thought about this very much. Maybe I want to change my, maybe my font. So maybe I'll go to, what is it? Font family, maybe? We're going to find out. So yeah, okay. Font family, and you can read through this on W3 Schools to get more information about specific CSS properties. And I don't recommend trying to memorize a bunch of CSS properties and values because you can always look that stuff up later, but I do recommend getting in the habit of looking stuff up. So you can read more about this specific CSS property and the values that it takes, but just to get something working, I think I'll maybe copy paste my way to victory here. So maybe I will go with this. So I'm going to use an Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif font in my CSS. I'm going to change my font to those things. And let me run this and see what happens. So I'm going to kind of look at the text over there to see like the before, and then I'm going to hit run, and I'm hoping that the font changes. And it does. So now all of my p tags have a color and a font set on them. Okay, this is getting kind of annoying because I'm running out of white space, but that's okay. Maybe I'll make it a little smaller, actually. Okay. So this is what we've seen so far is, first of all, we saw like inline styles when I was using the style keyword down in here, but usually you won't want to use that. You'll want to use the like CSS syntax where you are using selectors and then properties. So from here, there's a couple things we could talk about. Next, maybe what I'll talk about, because this is the next sort of, I don't know, logical way of grouping your code, and you'll see this very often in other places, other tutorials and whatnot, is right now I have a style tag. And I can add other rules here. So for example, I can add a selector for my H1 tag, and maybe I can say that I want that to be red, for example, and that'll work. But similar to before, where I said that if you have a style attribute on every single tag, it's going to kind of get really annoying to work with and kind of hard to change. And it's also going to be impossible, actually, to have multiple styles that apply to multiple pages. So you, similar to how you won't use the style tag usually, or the style attribute usually, you also usually won't use the style tag. I did it this way just to show you another way to do it, but let me maybe shortcut us to like the real way of doing that. And that is with a line of code that actually links two files together. So I actually never remember it off the top of my head, but if I look for external style sheets, I'm looking for this line of code here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my editor, and instead of my style tag, I'm going to paste that line of code, and it says link. So it's a link tag with rel of style sheet, type of text CSS, and then an href pointing to styles.css, but I need that to be style. So the href is the important part. That needs to be the name of a CSS file. Okay, so now that we have this line of code is telling your browser to, instead of looking for a style tag, or actually in addition to, but instead of looking for the styles inside of a style tag, instead, go look at that other file. Go look at style.css. So what I want to do next is move the CSS that I previously had inside my style tag. I'm going to move that over to style.css. And I'm just going to get rid of the default, and I'm going to paste in what I had before. And will that automatically format? No. Is there a way to automatically format it? No. Whatever. So now my style.css file contains my CSS rules, so my selectors and the properties, and my index.html file just points to that file. And this is really common. This is the way it's usually done, because now my styling is kind of separate from my content, and I can now point to this style.css file from multiple web pages. So if I had like a home page and like an about me page and like a list of my favorite places and a list of a bunch of images I took, I could write one CSS file and style my whole web page with them, all of those web pages with that one file. So usually it's a separate file. So anyway, I wanted to demonstrate it this way, because that's what you'll usually see, and I guess I'll stick with this for the rest of this little guide. Okay, so far we've seen different ways to specify CSS, whether that's an inline style using the style attribute, or like an internal style sheet using the style tag, or this is an external style sheet, which is using the link tag and then pointing to a separate CSS file. So we've seen that, and we've seen using a selector to add styles to particular elements. Okay, so next what I want to do is talk about the different kinds of selectors you can have. So far I have used two element selectors, and that's this P here and this H1 here. They're called element selectors because that's exactly what they do. They select a element. So in this case, this P here is telling your browser to apply these styles to every P tag. But what if I didn't want my styles to apply to every single P tag? What if I wanted them to apply to a specific P tag, so just one of them? And I could go back to our old friend, the style attribute, and I could style it this way. But like I said, you're usually not going to want to do that. So instead, what I can do is give this P tag an ID. So I'm going to add an attribute to this P tag, and I'm going to say ID, and then an equal sign, and then in quotation marks, I'm going to give this an ID. So this can be anything I want. I'm going to maybe call it like subtitle, since it's like right below my heading. You know, maybe I'm using this as my subtitle, and I can save this and run it, and so far nothing should change. Cool. All I've done right now is add an ID attribute to this first P tag. Only that first P tag has that ID. So now back in my CSS file, I can use an ID selector to select just that P tag. So I'm going to do that by giving myself some white space first, and then I'm going to use the pound symbol, or the hashtag symbol, I guess, and then the name of my ID, which I have already forgotten. I think I called it subtitle. Subtitle, and then an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. And again, I like to give myself some white space. that's funny. It's just yelling at me that I haven't actually added any properties. Okay, calm down, Replit. And now inside of those curly braces, I can add whatever styling I want. So let's say maybe I want to make this bold. So I'm going to maybe demonstrate how I would figure that out if I didn't know ahead of time. So maybe I'll type into a search engine like CSS bold text. And yep, bunch of options to pick from, and you know, any of them will probably be good enough. But here's one from W3 Schools that looks pretty promising. Another one from W3 Schools, maybe. All right, let's go this one. And font weight bold. Okay, that looks pretty promising. Or it looks like I can give it a number. Okay, that's cool. I might play with that as well. But let me go back to my CSS, and I'm just going to paste that in. So now I am saying, in my CSS file here, which is using Css Syntax, which has a selector, in this case an ID selector, and then a set of Css properties and values, I am telling CSS to find the element with the ID of subtitle and make it bold. So I'm going to save this and run it, and there you go. Now you see that my hello world is indeed bold. Cool. So that is using an ID selector. So now you can style like very specific elements in your page, and you can style a bunch of elements using the element selector. But what if you wanted to do something that's kind of in between those two things? I don't want to style every single p tag, and I don't want to style just one of them. In this case, I don't know, let's say I want to style the two bottom ones. And I could, you know, again, I could do that maybe by giving them both inline styles. I could maybe try to give them both the same ID, but for various reasons, you're not supposed to do that. I think it will actually work this week, but it will start to break in later weeks. So for now, take my word for it. If you give an ID to an element, you can't use that ID anywhere else. So I can't have another p tag that has ID equals subtitle. Again, I think it'll work for now, but it will break in the future. So yeah, okay. It works now, but it'll break in a couple weeks when we get to JavaScript. So don't use the same ID multiple times. Okay, so back to my main goal of styling my two p tags with the same styles, knowing that I can't use the same ID multiple times. Well, good news, don't worry. There's another CSS selector type, which is it's called class. So I can give it a class, same way I've done it. I've given it an ID, just using a class attribute here. So I'm going to say class equals, and then quotation marks, and then I'm going to call this something. I can call it anything I want. Maybe I'll just call it like class, maybe description, because I'm kind of describing things in those paragraphs. And I'm going to type the same thing on this p tag as well. Description. I'm spelling it totally wrong. Description. Okay, cool. Maybe I'll add some white space just to clean it up a little bit. Okay. So now I have a p tag with an ID of subtitle, and then I have a p tag with a class of description, and I have another p tag with a class of description. I haven't actually done anything with that yet, so I'm going to run this and just double check that it does, it does the same thing that it was before. But now that I have an element, or actually two elements, with this class attribute, I can go back to my styles, my style.css file, and I can use that class selector to select those two elements. So to use a class selector in CSS, instead of starting with the pound symbol or the hash symbol, you use a dot. So I'm going to say dot description, and then curly braces. And now inside of those curly braces, I can add my CSS styling rules, which are property values and names and values. So I'm running out of things to style, but maybe I want to make them, I don't know, italic. So I'm going to say CSS Italic Text. If you don't know how to do it, use your favorite search engine and read through and look for specific, more specific styling rules that you can use. So, yeah, okay, maybe font, maybe CSS Tricks is a pretty great resource, so I'll check that out. How to italicize text. It looks like there's a way to do it in HTML directly. That's true, but okay, this is what I'm looking for. I wanted this. I wanted to do it in CSS. So okay, let me go here, and okay, so now back in my CSS file, I have used the class selector for description, and I am now going to add that CSS rule where I'm saying the font style should be italic, and I'm going to run this. And now what I'm expecting is my two bottom p tags should be italicized. So I'm going to run this, and there we go. So what we've seen so far is a few different things, but maybe skipping over the journey here, what I want to maybe focus on is what we have on the screen is, first of all, we have a bunch of HTML, which is still mostly about the content itself. So this heading has my heading here, and then a bunch of p tags. They have like, a subtitle and then some descriptions. But what I don't have in here is a bunch of like specifications about the color or the border or whether it's bold or italicized. I don't have that in the HTML itself, and that's what I said earlier, where usually you keep them separate. Because like the HTML is saying here's what the content is, and then the CSS is saying basically here's how I paint that. So anyway, I have my HTML tags, and I have a mix of just plain old tags, and one of these tags has an ID, and then two of them has a class. And now in my CSS file over here, I have a series of CSS selectors. So I have a couple element selectors that just use the raw tag. I have an ID selector that uses the hash symbol, and then I have a class selector that uses the dot at the beginning. And all of those then contain curly braces that contain CSS rules or styling properties. And all of that combines to make this now very beautiful example website. Okay, so from here, maybe one thing I'll mention just really quickly is I think I've used the word CSS a bunch, but I don't think I've actually defined it. So CSS is cascading style sheet, and let's maybe do those in reverse order. So by sheet, it just means it's this file. It's a sheet of rules. Okay, you can think of a CSS file as a sheet, style sheet. And on that sheet is just a description of how you want your page to look. Okay, so that's the last S, CSS. The style part is, I guess, maybe obvious. So you have a sheet of styles. Okay, so that's what a style sheet is. Okay, what about that C part, the cascading part? And this is a really powerful and kind of more advanced artifact of how CSS works. And that is that these rules combine. So for example, I have this P right here, this P selector, which selects every single p tag on my page. And so I have 3 p tags in my index file over here, p, and that rule, that selector, says all of those paragraph tags should be colored blue, and they should have a font of Arial. If you don't have that, then Helvetica. If you don't have that, then sans serif. Cool. But notice that that applies to all 3 of my p tags. Okay, so stay with me for a second. And then when I get to this ID selector of subtitle, that's only one of my p tags here. That's this first one. And this CSS rule says that you should give whatever has that ID a bold font. But the thing to notice, or the thing that's important here, is that It's bold, yes, but it's also blue. And it's blue because the P selector and the subtitle selector combine. And that's what cascading means. So you sort of start with the least specific selector, which in this case is the P tag because it selects basically every single P tag, so it's not very specific at all. And then you apply rules sort of in order based on how specific something is. So classes are more specific than elements, and IDs are more specific than classes. There's a bunch of other rules related to how things combine, but I did just want to mention that the C part of CSS stands for cascading, which you can think of as all of those rules combine to decide the final form of what your tags look like. Okay, I think I'm just about done. Let me double check that I'm not forgetting anything. So as you are curious about how all of this works and the different things you can do, like I've said in pretty much every video, my goal here is not to teach you a bunch of things that you memorize. So for this particular video, I don't think that you should try to go memorize every single CSS property. You won't be able to, and you shouldn't, because you can always look that stuff up. So from here, let's say that I wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to maybe, I'm trying to think, maybe I wanted to, I already used border. What's another thing I can do? I can maybe I'll add a list to my index. So I'll say my favorite food is, and I'm just changing my HTML real quick just to sort of get something working. So I'm going to have a list, and in that I'm going to say ice cream, pasta. I'm a very healthy person, and you know what? Now I feel guilty, so I'm going to say salad. Okay, so I'm going to save that. Does that all format? It does. Okay, so now I have a list here, and now I'm kind of back to having that boring default styling. So let's say, for example, I wanted to get rid of these dots. I didn't want my list to have those dots. Those dots are there by default, and I want to change those. So my whole point for all of this is don't memorize that. Don't try to go to a big list and read through every single thing. Now that you have this this goal of I want to get rid of those dots or I want to change those dots, go to your favorite search engine, type in CSS li, what are those things called? Dots? I'll just say dots. And okay, CSS styling lists. Okay, this looks promising. And ooh, looks like there's a bunch of options. So I can have different marker types, it looks like. I can do different maybe numbering systems. So okay, looks like what I'm looking for is maybe the list style type property. And so, this page is kind of short, so maybe I'll do another search for that. So I'll type CSS and then that property name list style type. And is this the page I was just on? Or does this have more information? So, okay, looks like I have some options, circle and square. Okay, I'm not sure what the default is. I think it might tell me somewhere. Oh, all kinds of options here. So the default is disk, which is a filled circle. Okay, so maybe I'll just try circle. So anyway, so now that I have kind of a familiarity with the property name and the value, what was it? It was list style type, and then it can take, values like circle and square. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my CSS or back to my project here. And there's a few things I could do. I could maybe give these classes or IDs, but maybe I'll just jump over to the styles.css. Maybe I'll select every single one of them. So I'm going to have my element selector, and in here I'm going to say list style type, and I'm going to try circle. And semicolon, just in case I want to add more, but let me run this and see what happens. And there you go. It's not the biggest change in the world, but you can apply that same process to getting your website to look more like what you intended. Okay, so I think I'm going to end it there. That was CSS in a nutshell. So what we did is we walked through a few different ways of adding styles. So we started with the inline styles using the style attribute. And that is good for things like, I don't know, if you want to get something working really quick and you just want to see what it looks like, you can use the style tag, but it gets pretty, or the style attribute, I mean, but that gets pretty unwieldy. So then we learned about the style tag, which went up in the head section of an HTML file. So yeah, here's an example. Where you have your CSS directly in your HTML file in a style tag, but even that gets pretty annoying to work with. So then we jumped over to the external style sheet, which is usually how you'll see it out in the wild. And that used this line here, this link tag, which points to a CSS file. And then that CSS file can contain your selectors and CSS rules or properties and values. And from there, then there are kind of two other things to talk about. One is like selectors, which we talked about element selectors, ID selectors, and class selectors, and then rules or properties. And those are things like color or font weight or font style. And you can get way more information about them on your favorite search engine. So from here, it's a mix of all of those. And what you do kind of depends on exactly what your goal is. So I can't kind of tell you ahead of time like exactly whether to use an element selector or a class selector or an ID selector. And I can't tell you exactly what property to use because it's going to depend on exactly what your goal is. And so yeah, hopefully that helps orient you in the space, but a lot of it's going to depend on exactly what your goal is. Okay, all right, I'm getting rambly, so I'm going to end it there. That was CSS. So now you are able to beautify your web page and make your web page styled really however you want, and you unlock a lot of really cool things with there. But I'm going to end it there. So I will say thanks for watching and have fun with CSS.